Good day. The last 24 hours will either come to be seen as perhaps the most consequential in American history post the Second World War, or as a absurd or bizarre punctuation mark in the story of the continuity of American government. I say that because it's become clear to me, at least over the last couple of hours, 24 hours, what the actual purpose of the various appointments that Donald Trump has been seeking to make to his administration, what the true purpose of all of these appointments is. And I'm going to suggest that it has actually less, in some respects, to do with foreign policy. It's in some ways not even connected, or at least not directly connected, to things like economic policy and things of that kind. It is connected first and foremost with the question of who has power in Washington, power at the absolute center of American government in Washington, D.C. itself. And I'm also going to suggest that all of these attempted appointments, none of the people who I'm going to discuss are yet in position. They need to be confirmed by the Senate. All of these attempted appointments explains now a great deal of the rhetoric that we saw during the presidential election. The overheated comments about Donald Trump aiming for some sort of dictatorship, some sort of absolute power in the United States. The talk that he was engaged in a policy of retribution, of settling of scores with his political enemies. All of this now makes a great deal more sense, and it suggests that there's been a lot more understanding within the political class of what it is Donald Trump has been attempting to do than perhaps I, from a distance in London, had fully understood. So what did happen over the last 24, or perhaps one should more accurately say 36 to 48 hours? Well, first of all, we now have confirmation that Marco Rubio is indeed being nominated as Secretary of State. In some respects, though, as I will say, this is the least important of the appointments that we have seen up to this time. The State Department, of course, remains a core institution of the US government. It is an institution which has obviously overall control of US foreign policy. And in appointing Marco Rubio, Donald Trump is going for someone who is certainly acceptable to the political establishment in Washington, and who, at the same time, has shown a certain flexibility over the last few years, sufficient flexibility to adapt himself to the changes in the political situation in the United States, in particular and specifically to the rise of Donald Trump. But I'm going to suggest this is in fact the least important, or at least the least consequential appointment. Because look at the various other people that Donald Trump is appointing to senior positions to run major departments of the US government. And when we do that, we have a completely different picture. Firstly, we have Pete Hegseth, who's been made Secretary of Defense. He does have a military background. He has served in the military. He's had a distinguished record as a military officer in the Middle East. But of course, he's not, as I've discussed in previous programs, my previous program, been somebody with much experience of managing the gigantic bureaucracy, which is what we see within the Department of Defense. However, he is staunchly loyal to Donald Trump, and he's somebody who shares, one senses, Donald Trump's overall perspectives about the nature of power in Washington itself. We see the same with John Ratcliffe, who's now the CIA director. He is somebody who has been loyal to Donald Trump in the past. He has experience of the US intelligence community. He's not somebody who is completely surprising as a potential CIA director, but he does appear to have different perspectives from the kind of CIA directors we have seen before, people like Bill Burns and others that we can think of. So those two appointments, and then we get to the very controversial appointments that Trump proposed yesterday. Matt Gaetz, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, as Attorney General, in charge of the Department of Justice and by extension the FBI, and Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence. In the case of Tulsi Gabbard, I should say that I do know a fair amount about her, followed her career closely. She is somebody who I strongly like. I am, if you like, a supporter of hers. I think she has shown great courage in her political perspectives. I was deeply, deeply troubled by the treatment that the Democratic Party machine extended to her during the 2019-2020 primaries, the way she was basically frozen out of all discussions, prevented from making the impact in the primaries, basically by cutting off all publicity to her, which the early indications suggested that she would certainly have made had the primaries been conducted as a proper open contest. And, well, briefly, I think that amongst the people who take an interest in foreign policy, she has consistently shown a wisdom and a sense that is very lacking amongst the political class, the more mainstream people in the political class. It is also fair to say, however, that she has not, as far as I know, had much of a background in intelligence matters. And those opinions that Tulsi Gabbard has had about foreign policy, which I broadly share, are not the opinions shared by the great majority of the political class that has controlled things in Washington basically ever since the start of the Cold War. She is, in fact, somebody who most of the political class in Washington would perceive as something of a heretic. And now, together with Radcliffe, she's been put in charge of the US intelligence community as Director of National Intelligence. There is horror and outrage from all the predictable people. I've seen a message posted on Twitter X saying that appointing Tulsi Gabbard is overcomplicated. A more straightforward thing to do would have just been to appoint Putin himself to the post. A ludicrous and offensive slur, I should say, but one which is fairly typical of the way in which the political class is reacting to Tulsi Gabbard's appointment. So, Tulsi Gabbard, and of course, Matt Gaetz, representative, a member of the House of Representatives, the person who played a critical role in ousting Speaker McCarthy, who gained significant support from the Republican caucus within the House of Representatives, a person who clearly is a strong supporter of Donald Trump, all of which, again, of course, makes him unacceptable to the American political class. I say that, of course, Gates has legal training. He has practiced as a lawyer for, as I understand it, all of 2 years. Perhaps he is not the most qualified person around for this post. Just to say, though it is far from unusual, in my experience, for presidents to pick for the position of Attorney General people who are close to them, close political allies and friends. But anyway, that's one other thing. There's also stories about all sorts of acts of sexual misconduct that I'm not going to waste any time on. There was an investigation. As far as I'm aware, Gates was cleared. I don't really see any sense or point in raking all that up. But of course, Gates's many political enemies are busy doing so. I cannot help but think that the true reason why there has been an absolutely furious reaction to Gates's nomination is not because he is less qualified for the post than other attorney generals have been, nor these stories about sexual misconduct, of which, by the way, to repeat again, he's been cleared, but rather the fact that he is known to be a very strong political ally of Donald Trump, somebody who's argued his case, Trump's case, in the House of Representatives, and who committed the ultimate outrage of maneuvering out of office Speaker McCarthy, who was, of course, very much part of the old Republican establishment. So these appointments, Hegseth, Gabbard, Ratcliffe, and Gates, I think, tell us fairly clearly what it is that Donald Trump is aiming to do. What he is aiming to do is to break the power in Washington of what Barack Obama apparently once called the blob, what others call the deep state, what could be called all sorts of other things. The word interagency sometimes floats up, though the word interagency also has more innocuous meanings in Washington. But anyway, the collection of different agencies and individuals who, taken together, have constituted the permanent government of the United States, operating within the bureaucracy, who made Donald Trump's life all but impossible during his first term, who subjected him to endless investigations and allegations, and who also derailed Trump's attempts to make fundamental changes to US foreign policy. You could argue, and I'm sure that Trump and his supporters would argue, and by the way, I'm inclined to agree, that this is an attempt to bring this group of people, the blob, the deep state, the interagency, call it whatever words you like, to bring, basically to break its power and to bring the US bureaucracy finally back under proper constitutional oversight and political control, in other words, by the elected officers of the United States, first and foremost the president himself and his political advisors, which is what the founders of the United States intended. Of course, they themselves and their many supporters in the media and in Congress and elsewhere see things very differently. From their perspective, this is a power grab, a massive power grab by Donald Trump. He's inserting loyalists into the system. He is breaking the power of the supposedly impartial bureaucracy. He's taking control of it. He is exacting vengeance on his political enemies within the bureaucracy. And he's putting himself in a position of, well, perhaps not dictatorship. That remains an absurdly overinflated and exaggerated view of Trump's eventual position, but certainly in a position of leadership such as no modern president relative to the bureaucracy has had, arguably, since the time of FDR. So there we are. That's the battle that is being waged. Obviously, all of these people, Hegseth, Radcliffe, Gabbard, and Gates, are outsiders, because to carry out this kind of operation, Trump must rely on outsiders with a proven record of loyalty to himself. If he goes again, if he repeats the experiment that he tried during his first term and appoints to all of these positions people who are familiar with the bureaucracies, who share their perspectives, who know, in a sense, how to get things done in the traditional way in Washington, people like McMaster's and Tillerson and Mattis and others who, Dan Coates and others who were, Gina Haspel, who were running things in Washington during Trump's first term. Well, experience has taught Trump that if that happens, instead of being the person in actual control, he will become, in effect, their prisoner. After all, as he has probably not forgotten, when he did attempt to try to change policies, or at least gave some indication that he might be interested in changing policies, specifically on the Ukraine issue, he was criticized by Colonel Vindman of the National Security Council for going against the policy of the interagency. In other words, the permanent government of the United States, whose priorities apparently were more binding, or were binding on the president himself, such that if he decided to change them, then he was a legitimate target for impeachment. So that's, I think, what Donald Trump is trying to take on. And in the meantime, he's put Marco Rubio in charge of the State Department, because he believes that Rubio, who is, after all, a member of the Senate, somebody very acceptable to the permanent state of the United States, the permanent government of the United States, the blob, the interagency, the deep state, call it whatever you like, that Marco Rubio, who is also, from Trump's point of view, somebody who's shown that he's willing to work with Trump, he can be relied upon to keep the State Department under some kind of control, to run things in foreign policy, whilst Trump and the people around him focus principally on this drive to bring the government in Washington to heel. And here we can now see and understand better the role of Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Because, of course, all of these people, as I said, people like Gabbard, Hegseth, Gates, all of these people, Hegseth, none of them has much of a record in running bureaucracies or in fighting bureaucratic battles, whereas, of course, Musk and Ramaswamy, as businessmen, emphatically do. Musk has a considerable experience of working with various agencies of the United States government and is probably fairly well informed about a lot of the things that go on within that government. He also is the person who owns Twitter X, which will be presumably an important vehicle where all of these various people and their supporters will now be able to express freely their point of view, even as this drive to reshape the government takes place. In fact, I'm going to suggest that these various changes, these various appointments, people like Hegseth, Radcliffe, Gabbard, and Gates, only really make sense if one understands that Musk and Ramaswamy are expected to play the central role in carrying this major change in the United States through. So, I said at the start of this program that this would all be hugely consequential, and it will be if it succeeds. If Donald Trump and this group of people that he's brought together are able to do these things, to break the power of the bureaucracy, the permanent government of the United States, the people who've basically been running things in Washington ever since the start of the Cold War, then that will mark a fundamental change in the political culture of the United States. We will finally have left behind us the structures, the political structures created by the Cold War. We will have a completely different type of politics. I think, I'm going to say it, a better type of politics. But certainly it will be a very, very different type of politics to the one that we have seen up to now. However, if it fails, then of course this will be seen as yet another attempt by Trump and those around him to try to slow down or shift the bureaucratic juggernaut which ultimately prevails against all of its various adversaries. Now, this is what I think about these appointments. I'm going to say a few more things about the people who have been appointed shortly, but this is what I think this is all intended to do. I know that some people will say that I am making assumptions about Donald Trump, that I'm looking for a more structural explanation to what Donald Trump is trying to do than he is capable of. Many people have all kinds of ideas about Trump. A lot of people, somewhat to my surprise, continue to think him essentially unintelligent. I've never seen that at all, actually. I mean, he obviously has a certain way of expressing himself. He's not perhaps the most structured person in the way he speaks and explains things. But I think that his political understanding is significantly more developed, a lot more developed than he's generally credited with. And the same, of course, applies to his understanding of American politics and of the feelings and opinions of the tens of millions of Americans who have come out and voted for him. I think, in other words, that he is an underestimated man. Well, there we go. Will it succeed? Will it work? Well, I have to say, I think the odds are heavily against it. The president is a figure with immense theoretical power. He can, in theory, dismiss anybody he wants from any section of the government. He has complete freedom to do that. They all serve at his will. I don't think there's any serious debate about that. He has that behind him. He also has a popular mandate behind him. He won the election. He won the election in extraordinary circumstances, coming back from a period when he lost the presidency. He's the first person since Grover Cleveland in the 1880s to win the presidency back. I've already pointed out that what Grover Cleveland was able to achieve back in the 1880s belongs to a different political and historical age. Donald Trump is the first person in modern American politics to do this. And that is an astonishing achievement. He's also somebody who's managed to keep going in the face of all kinds of court cases, of two very serious assassination attempts, the first of which almost killed him. He's fought against relentless abuse and vilification and has managed to prevail in spite of that. He's managed to prevail against the almost complete criticism of the mainstream media in the United States. He has had some friends in the media, in the New York Post, from time to time, in Fox News. But overall, the media in general has been bitterly hostile to him. So the idea that he is without cards to play would certainly be wrong. And he does have some very, very formidable people working with him. And we've discussed some of who these are. And I suspect that before long, we're going to find that Robert Kennedy Jr. also is going to have a role in all of this, and probably a significant role as well. But nonetheless, as somebody who has worked inside government bureaucracies, as a grizzled veteran of many bureaucratic battles, I have to say that the odds against him succeeding, defeating a bureaucracy as powerful and as well established as the one that we see in Washington now, is an extremely tall order indeed. Moreover, when we're talking about the bureaucracy, we need to understand that the bureaucracy extends in the United States beyond government. There are all the extraordinary think tanks that are clustered around Washington, that are all connected to the bureaucracy in all kinds of ways. There are people within the academic community who are also involved in the bureaucracy or have been involved in the bureaucracy as well. Victoria Nuland, by way of example, is now an academic at Columbia University. And of course, she's not the only one who fills that kind of role. There is the court system, very difficult to break or change. Many people would say it was very improper to even think of doing such a thing. I would have said the same a few years ago, but of course I've seen the lawfare cases that have been such a problem in the United States over the last number of years, and well, I do think that there's a lot in the legal system in the United States that could benefit from a major overhaul, though I would be nervous about how that needs to be carried out, in spite of all that I have said. But anyway, there is potential challenges from the judicial system as well. And then, of course, there is Congress. And yes, the Republicans have, as is now confirmed, gained control of the House of Representatives as well. So they, in theory, control both houses of Congress. But saying the Republicans is not saying that Donald Trump's party controls Congress, because Trump has political enemies within the Republican Party. And I get the sense that they are a diminished force, but they have not gone away. In fact, yesterday, they gained their first success. They managed to elect Senator Thune, again, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, to be the Senate Majority Leader in place of Mitch McConnell. Trump's preferred choice, didn't actually say that it was his choice, but it was fairly clear that most of Trump's people were expressing a preferred choice, which I'm sure was Donald Trump's. Tim Scott was eliminated from the first round. So we see that the old Republican establishment, the establishment that still might be said to be embodied by the personality of Mitch McConnell, the old Republican establishment continues to exercise a very, very strong position in the Senate. And of course, they've shown repeatedly that they're not averse to teaming up with Democrats in order to thwart or defeat Donald Trump. And they, of course, some people call the rhinos, Republicans in name only, those people not only oppose Donald Trump, but they will oppose his appointments. He will oppose the actions that these appointments point towards, the attempts to clear up the bureaucracy, to cut it down, to assert political control over the bureaucracy. They will oppose all of that because, to say straightforwardly, they are political allies. They are people who accept the same orthodoxies that the bureaucracy was defending in Trump's first term, and which these people in Congress that I've just been talking about still defend and hold to this day. So it's not a done thing that Donald Trump can prevail against these people, because in order to get all of these people confirmed, he needs a vote to confirm them from the Senate. And already we can see that some Republican senators, Senator Mercouris, for example, others, are looking like they're going to act to try to stop the appointment of people like Gatz and Gabbard to the positions that Donald Trump has nominated them to. So I predict that we're going to see play out over the next few months the battle between the immovable object, the permanent government of the United States and its many allies, and the irresistible force, Donald Trump, and the movement that he represents. And of course, even as this battle plays out in Washington, it is going to be a battle fought, I suspect, with considerable energy and ferocity on both sides. Even as that battle has to play out, the president and his officials, and indeed Congress to some extent as well, will have to also deal with the other thing, which they are there to do, which is conduct the government of the United States and its foreign policy in particular. Now, I get the sense that Donald Trump is going to be mostly successful in getting the people he has appointed to the various economic teams, about whom I know very little, by the way. I suspect he's going to be broadly successful in getting these people confirmed by the Senate. Rubio also is certain to be confirmed by the Senate. So there will be a government of the United States functioning over the next year. But I suspect that the major focus, the principal political issue, the thing that will be playing out most in the minds of all of the various people in Washington is going to be, as I said, this battle to reshape and change the character of American government. And that, almost by definition, is going to leave less time and energy for some of the other things. The economy, I think, will continue to receive a heavy priority. Donald Trump is almost certainly not going to just let things in the economy slide and is not going to simply leave those things just to the economic and technical officials. I think he understands how vitally important the economy is from every conceivable point of view. But I suspect that many questions of foreign policy will be given less priority over the next year or two whilst this battle in Washington plays out than might otherwise be the case. Of course, there is a possibility that Trump will simply get his way, that he'll be able to ram through these appointments because the Republicans in the Senate are still too awed by his personality and the political force arrayed behind him to resist. That is not a possibility that should be discounted. Or it could be that all of these appointments are going to fall apart right at the beginning and that neither Gates nor Gabbard, for example, are appointed, and that Trump is going to be obliged to make compromises with the people he is trying to defeat far more quickly than he would otherwise do, which will dampen down the political temperature and will leave us with a government in the United States that is going to be a lot more conventional than this one looks. So, I mean, those are possibilities. But as I said, as of today, it is still possible that we could get a major political battle play out in the United States over the next 2 years. And of course, who wins that battle will matter very much in looking at the direction America takes going forward. Now, that then brings us back to the topic that I discussed yesterday, the fact that all of these people, except, well, even Tulsi Gabbard, actually, to some degree, that one of the things that all of these people have in common is a visceral hostility to Iran and a certain hostility to China. And I think now it's perhaps easier to understand why, in spite of or because of these views, these people have been appointed to the positions that they have been appointed to, which is that Donald Trump's principal objective in appointing these people is to help him win his battle in Washington. It's inevitable, therefore, that he's going to have to reach out beyond the leadership, the traditional leadership of the Republican Party, to people who are closer to the grassroots, to people who have a proven track record of loyalty to himself. That means middle-ranking military officers like Tulsi Gabbard and Mike Waltz. It means people like Radcliffe and Hegseth and people like that. And of course, these people do have certain views in common, and hostility to Iran is one of them. So that has played, I think, that explains to some extent, as I said, why we see this pattern take shape within the new government. Perhaps Trump himself shares these views to a certain extent. If so, he needs to be very careful, as I said, that he's not led, that these people don't let their interest in the Middle East run away with itself, pulling him into new wars. Because if that is what happens, then by definition, he's going to be tied up dealing with the wars in the Middle East and not with this program of reorganization and reform at the center of power in Washington that he wants. So he's got that problem to think about and worry about as well. And that has to be something that we will see whether he's able to keep control over it. Now, I'm going to address to one inevitable point, which repeatedly comes up, which is that the people who've been appointed to all of these positions, Hegseth, Waltz, the others, have been appointed to these positions not by Donald Trump, but by other people in Jerusalem, Prime Minister Netanyahu, all that sort of thing. I think if the Israeli government were exercising that kind of influence, we would not be getting individuals like Hegseth appointed to the Department of Defense. There are very, very senior people within the American political class, within the Republican establishment, who the Israelis, I am sure, would certainly prefer to individuals like Hegseth, not to mention Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and people like that. On the contrary, the current makeup of Trump's team only makes sense if it is focused on this struggle in Washington rather than preparing the ground for some kind of a conflict in the Middle East. So that is the first thing I'm going to say about this. I find that argument very unpersuasive. No doubt the Israelis preferred these people to some of the other people that might have been appointed in Washington, but they can hardly be optimal choices from an Israeli point of view. The Israelis would surely prefer more establishment figures, reliable friends who would be able to unite the whole of the US government in support of them, rather than settle for unusual picks like this. And the other thing that, of course, people will inevitably say is, again, it reflects the point that I've just said before, that Donald Trump, in picking loyalists, isn't really interested in any kind of reform or in any sort of policy. He's basically just creating a Praetorian Guard to protect himself. Well, again, there may be some truth in that, but that doesn't explain the role of Elon Musk and Ramaswamy in the government as well. And it seems to me that if you put all of the various pieces together, inevitably you're going to come to the conclusion that I have come to, about which I am confident. It doesn't, to repeat again, follow that Trump is going to succeed. It is also the case that Trump himself may not have the political energy and the degree of stubbornness and consistency to see this thing through. He might get bored and tired with all of this eventually and lose interest, and that isn't impossible at all. I'm not, as I said, engaging in any great expectations, but I think it's now fairly clear what we're seeing and how things are going to play out, at least over the next few weeks. Anyway, there we are. That is my understanding of the situation in Washington and about these new Trump appointments. We're going to have very, very interesting times over the next couple of weeks. Lots to discuss in programs. I'm interested to see how this plays out. To repeat again, if I had to put money, I would put it. I'm not a gambling man. I would put my money on the permanent state winning out in the end. But Trump is not someone to be underestimated, nor other people around him. So there we go. Let's move on, because of course one government is especially worried and concerned about all of these developments, and that government is the government in Ukraine. And we have been hearing extraordinary things rumbling around in the background, suggesting that not just Trump's victory, but the overall shift in American policy, which began under the existing Biden administration before the election, is starting to create real concerns and ructions in Kiev, and that we could be looking at important political developments there. Now, about a week ago, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, published a report saying that the United States was, and the various NGOs and agencies that it has established in Kiev, has now concluded that Zelensky's potential is exhausted, that he needs to be persuaded to leave the scene, that there have to be elections in Ukraine, that a new pro-American government needs to be set up, and that the United States has been working to that objective with a plan to hold elections, parliamentary and presidential elections in Ukraine sometime in May 2025. Now, that was what the Russian intelligence agency, the SVR, said. I have to say, when I saw that report, I thought it was interesting, but one always wonders where the SVR, the Russians, get this information. And they have in the past floated stories about the Americans becoming discontented with Zelensky and looking for ways to remove him. And, well, suffice to say, it's never quite happened like that. Well, now we have an article in The Economist which essentially tells us the same thing, that there is indeed some kind of a plan being hatched in Kiev to move forward towards elections in May, that there is talk that Zelensky has served his time, that it's time for him to go. Supposedly, there are even, sorry, I've still got Anyway, supposedly there are even suggestions that he might be persuaded to step down before the elections take place. After all, he did at one time promise that he would serve only for one term, and that there will be, in other words, in May, a new government led by someone else who would change, presumably, the policies followed by Ukraine, and do so from a position of political legitimacy, which the Russians certainly would say Zelensky himself, for the moment, doesn't have. Well, that's the view. I don't think it's very difficult to guess, by the way, who the person who would take over from Zelensky would be, who these people have in mind as Zelensky's successor. It is clearly General Valery Zaluzhny, the former military commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, currently in London as ambassador to the United Kingdom, though he does travel back to Ukraine fairly regularly. It looks as if, to say it simply, there is now a plot, because this is what this looks like to me, a plot to leverage Zelensky out of his position, get Zaluzhny to step in, and to use Zaluzhny, presumably, to begin the negotiations with the Russians, which some people, I think, still hope, will result in a freeze of the conflict along the current battle lines. So this plot, it seems, is underway. Now, there are, however, other people with different views. Zelensky himself, in particular, shows no interest in elections. I gather that he has again ruled them out. So he shows no interest in elections. He's shown no inclination to leave the political scene. He has shown no desire to change the policy in any respect. He continues to rule out any territorial concessions to the Russians at all. He continues to insist that his plan, the Zelensky peace plan, the plan which demands the transfer back to Ukraine of all of the territories that Ukraine controlled before the 2014 crisis, is the only acceptable way forward, and only then and not before will he even consider talks. And we now have confirmation, important confirmation in the London Times of the threat Zelensky is making to the Western powers, primarily to the United States and ultimately to Donald Trump, if they start to withdraw their support. Now, a couple of weeks ago, just after Zelensky unveiled his victory plan to the Ukrainian parliament, he floated ideas that if the victory plan were not adopted, if the United States began to withdraw support, Ukraine would press forward and develop nuclear weapons. And he even gave the impression that he had made this identical threat, and by the way, it is a threat, to Donald Trump himself over the course of their meeting in New York in September. Well, there was something of a backlash, and Zelensky then appeared to retreat from that position. He said that Ukraine had no plan to develop or acquire nuclear weapons. But lo and behold, today in the London Times, we have an article from Maxim Tucker, which tells us that whilst it isn't still a plan, the idea of Ukraine developing nuclear weapons, and a plan for how it might be done does apparently exist. And the article from Maxim Tucker is entitled, "Could Zelensky use nuclear bombs? Ukraine's options explained." Kiev could rapidly develop a rudimentary weapon similar to that dropped on Nagasaki in 1945 to stop Russia if the United States cuts military aid, it has been suggested. And then we go on to read, Ukraine could develop a rudimentary nuclear bomb within months if Donald Trump withdraws US military assistance, according to a briefing paper prepared for the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. The country would quickly be able to build a basic device from plutonium with a similar technology to the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki in 1945, the report states. Creating a simple atomic bomb, as the United States did within the framework of the Manhattan Project, would not be a difficult task 80 years later, the document reads. And then we go on to read, with no time to build and run the large facilities required to enrich uranium, wartime Ukraine would have to rely instead on using plutonium extracted from spent fuel rods taken from Ukraine's nuclear reactors. Ukraine still controls 9 operational reactors and has significant nuclear expertise, despite having given up the world's 3rd largest nuclear arsenal in 1996. The last is a myth that will not die. If you go to the thread of this article in the London Times, you will see some people trying again to explain, in the face of some hostility from some of the readers, that in fact Ukraine never possessed nuclear weapons, that there were Soviet nuclear weapons located on its territory, but that they always remained under Moscow's control, and that by agreement with the United States as well, all of those nuclear weapons were returned to Russia. Anyway, I'm not going to dwell on that in this program, because doing so will just take up more time. Anyway, the article then goes on to say the report says the weight of reactor plutonium available to Ukraine can be estimated at 7 tons. A significant nuclear weapons arsenal would require much less material. The amount of material is sufficient for hundreds of warheads, with a tactical yield of several kilotons. Such a bomb would have about 1/10 of the power of Fat Man, the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. The document's authors conclude. And then the report goes on to say, that would be enough to destroy an entire Russian airbase or concentrated military, industrial, or logistics installation. The exact nuclear yield would be unpredictable because it would use different isotopes of plutonium. Rather disturbing. And we're told that the author of this report, Alexei Yizhak, is head of department at Ukraine's National Institute for Strategic Studies, a government research center that acts as an advisory body to the presidential office and the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. And then we're also told that the plutonium would need to be imploded using a complicated conventional explosion design, which must occur with a high detonation wave velocity simultaneously around the entire surface of the plutonium sphere. That's identical, by the way, to what the people at the Manhattan Project did. And we're told that the technology is challenging, but within Ukraine's expertise, according to this briefing paper. So there we are. It's the plan, or at least the threat. If you cut off aid, we will go ahead and develop nuclear weapons. And not only develop nuclear weapons, we will actually go ahead and use them. We will drop nuclear weapons on the Russians. We will convert the current conventional war in Ukraine, which we are losing, into an all-out nuclear war. Now, this is a briefing paper. It is not yet official Ukrainian policy. The article goes on to say that Western experts think that Ukraine would, in reality, need at least 5 years to be in a position to develop a workable nuclear bomb. I have to say that the idea of Ukraine developing a nuclear bomb in wartime conditions, with the Russians able to bomb and attack any location, anywhere they choose in Ukraine, seems to me a fantastic one. But put all that aside, put aside the question of whether or not this is even a practical idea, and think about what this briefing paper, which unquestionably reflects Zelensky's thinking. After all, it does chime exactly with what he's supposed to have said to Donald Trump back in September. Think what it means, because this briefing paper is not intended to intimidate the Russians. The Russians have been talking about the threat of Ukraine developing nuclear weapons since before the special military operation began. Putin, when he announced the special military operation, specifically and expressly referred to comments about acquiring nuclear weapons that Zelensky had himself made at the Munich Security Conference in February 2022, just 2 weeks before the special military operation began. In fact, it's been widely said that Putin was particularly angered and alarmed by those words of Zelensky's and by the fact that the Western listeners at the Munich Security Conference, who included Chancellor Scholz, Annalena Baerbock, Boris Johnson, Emmanuel Macron, and Kamala Harris, uttered not a word of pushback against them. And it was Putin's concern about these weapons, which was the final straw, the thing that finally decided him to launch the special military operation. So the Russians, reading all of this, are going to simply say to themselves, look, we were right all along. Zelensky really does have nuclear weapons on the brain. Ukraine most definitely does possess the expertise to develop nuclear weapons, and it does have the material to do so. Probably they wouldn't be able to do it in a few months' time. In fact, it's inconceivable that they could do it in a few months' time. But if we stop and leave these people in place, well, for all we know, that is exactly what they might do, in which case we could find ourselves in a very, very dangerous situation indeed. So the Russians are not going to be intimidated or forced or persuaded to stop the special military operation because they read things like this in the London Times. On the contrary, they will feel vindicated in their decision to start the special military operation because of what they're reading in the London Times. The point about this article, the point about this briefing paper, the point about what Zelensky said to Trump in September and what he again repeated just about 2 weeks ago about nuclear weapons is that he is in effect threatening, or if you prefer blackmailing, the United States. He is telling the United States, he's telling Donald Trump, look, either you just go on giving me everything I want, weapons, NATO entry, missile strikes against Russia, Tomahawk missiles, all of those things. Or I will go it alone, develop nuclear weapons, and launch them against the Russians, in which case you will get World War III, or at least you will get nuclear war in Europe. Because, of course, as Zelensky obviously knows, if anything like that were to happen, the Russians would respond in a reciprocal way with far more powerful nuclear strikes of their own. So this is, in effect, an attempt by Zelensky to blackmail the Americans. And one could see why, given that there are all these plots and conspiracies taking place in Kiev, while there's talk about all of these elections taking place, why, given that there's pressure on him to step down as well, one can begin to understand why he is responding in this way. And to say it simply, I think the fact that this briefing paper has been shared with the British and the details of it have been published in the London Times is not a coincidence. I believe that people in Zelensky's office have specifically approved this leak, and that Zelensky was at the very least a party to that decision. So there we are. That's Zelensky. He is digging in. He's making threats. He's threatening his own allies now with ideas of going nuclear, even as plots to remove him are mounting. And it was not just plots to remove him, because that same article in The Economist is now telling us all sorts of things about Zelensky that are very, very detrimental to him. He is apparently now perceived by his own generals as so unbalanced, so unwilling to listen to bad news, that it seems that they're actually lying to him. They're pretending to him that the military situation in Ukraine is not as bad as it really is. It is a most extraordinary revelation, most extraordinary series of comments in The Economist about how unbalanced the situation in Kiev has become. And of course, what it tells us about Zelensky, that ultimately he's not capable of accepting bad news, and that the result is that his own military, are not just giving him a warm bath. The word that's used is they're giving him a sauna. They're giving him far more encouraging information about the situation on the battlefield than the actual events really merit. Well, it tells us again how bizarre and terrible the situation with Zelensky has become. And again, I can't help but think that this is intended. It's another part of the game, the complex game, which we're seeing play out in order to try to remove him. So we see how the shift away from Project Ukraine by the Americans is upsetting the situation in Kiev. Zelensky's opponents, with the support of some people in the United States, apparently, trying to find ways to remove Zelensky and talking about elections in May, and Zelensky responding with talk of Ukraine acquiring nuclear weapons. And of course, the Europeans continuing to help Zelensky in every conceivable way they can. Their objective to keep the war going for as long as possible. Their fear that if the war ends, the Americans might walk away, not just from Ukraine, but from Europe as well. The Americans might start to focus more on their internal problems and on the situation in the Middle East, and in the Far East even more. So the Europeans determined to keep the war going. And more reports, more discussions about further loans and further transfers of funds to Ukraine. The British diplomat Ian Proud has written a good piece about this on his blog. You can also find it in Responsible Statecraft, the website of the Quincy Institute. Europe already Trump-proofing Ukraine war aid. As I said, the Europeans trying to keep the war going, even without the Americans. Utterly unrealistic though that is, and with hardliners like Josep Borrell once again now floating the possibility of seizing wholesale the Russian frozen assets, all $300 billion of them, and using the money to fund the war in Ukraine out of that. Going all the way, in other words, to continue to fund the war. So, ending the war in Ukraine is going to be somewhat complex, and the Russians themselves are completely unimpressed by all that is going on. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has given an interview in which he has said that he doesn't believe, the Russians don't believe, that Donald Trump's election is going to make any fundamental change to US policy. The Americans will continue much as they have been doing, which is Lavrov's way of saying, well, the Americans can do whatever they like, they can say whatever they like. Trump is talking apparently of appointing a special representative to see whether or not he can negotiate and persuade the Ukrainians and the Russians to sit down and negotiate with each other. Anyway, the Russians are listening, the Russians are hearing all of this. But basically what Lavrov is saying is, look, we don't really have any expectations of this. Obviously, we're going to sit down and talk if we're asked to. But as far as we are concerned, the special military operation goes on. We're not going to take any risks. We're not going to gamble on any changes in American policy. As far as we're concerned, the most important thing is to continue with a special military operation until its objectives are achieved. Here I'm going to finish by saying by saying briefly that this is how I think this is all going to shape out. I think Donald Trump is going to appoint a special representative. My colleague and friend Alex Christoforou floated the possibility that might be Rick Grenell, which is possible. I think this person will go to Moscow, which will be a first, by the way, and go to Kiev. I suspect that getting the Ukrainians to agree to sit down and talk with the Russians is going to prove incredibly difficult, and Zelensky will reject it outright. I think that it's going to be very difficult to organize elections in Ukraine in May, and forcing Zelensky out is going to prove extremely difficult also. And I think the Europeans will not want that to happen. So Rick Grenell is going to find it impossible to get serious talks started. And in the meantime, the Russians will continue the war. And Zelensky's various threats of going nuclear are going to incense and annoy the Americans, and are going to be seen by the Russians as the bluff they obviously are, and the Russians will have no hesitation in calling that bluff. But anyway, things could change. There might be a sudden shift in Kiev. It could be that the Americans finally lose patience and basically demand that Zelensky steps down if they conclude that this is the only way to get talks seriously started. So it could be that things might take a different turn, but that is what I predict we're most likely to see. The most important thing here is that if you are dealing with a political leader like Zelensky, who is making the kind of threats that he clearly is with nuclear weapons, then no responsible government in the world, not the American, not any of the European governments, not the European Union, should have any more dealings with a person like that. These threats should be sufficient by themselves to cause a total cut-off of all military and financial aid. The fact that that is not happening, that the Europeans want to go on helping Ukraine, just shows how completely detached from reality and how obsessed by their loathing of Putin and of Russia they have become. Now, that inevitably leads me to a discussion of the military situation. Now, a couple of days ago, about 2 days ago, I said that there were reports that the Russians have broken into Kupiansk itself and that there is fighting going on inside Kupiansk and that it looked as if the Russians might have occupied a football stadium in the northeast part of Kupiansk. This is on the very northern tip of the front lines, northern end of the front lines. Well, there was some uncertainty whether this was true, but yesterday video evidence appeared which did indeed show Russian troops advancing inside Kupiansk itself, the northeast part of Kupiansk, advancing all the way towards the industrial district in the central area of Kupiansk, east of the Oskol River. Now, there is a great deal of uncertainty about what all these reports and all this photographic and film evidence actually shows. Is this evidence of a genuine Russian advance into Kupiansk? If so, that would suggest that Ukrainian defences in Kupiansk have collapsed much more rapidly than anybody expected? Or was this simply another Russian reconnaissance group advancing deep into Kupiansk, scouting the situation there before pulling back? I simply don't know. The Ukrainian internet has burst into what I think it's fair to say is controlled hysteria over this development. There is shock and fury that the Russians were able to push so deep into Kupiansk, apparently without meeting any significant resistance. There are reports that the Ukrainians have attempted to push the Russians out of Kupiansk, and there are even some reports this morning that the Ukrainians have been successful in achieving that, and that the Russians have been pushed out of all of the territory of Kupiansk that they had briefly occupied. I am not on the scene. I don't know what is going on in Kupiansk. Some reports I'm reading, the very latest reports I'm reading, which admittedly are on the Russian side of the internet, suggest that the Russians have been able to hold their positions in Kupiansk. My own sense is that this is more like a reconnaissance in force, or if you like, a raid, rather than a serious attempt by the Russians to capture control of northeastern Kupiansk. But you don't get to repeat, I'm not there. I don't definitely know. What is indisputable, if you look at the latest maps, is that the territory south of Kupiansk and on the eastern bank of the Oskol River, that is still controlled by the Ukrainians is now shrinking fast. The Russians have pinned a group of Ukrainian troops basically to the east bank of the Oskol River. They surrounded them on three sides. They're squeezing the Ukrainians fast in this area. Soon, all of the territory east of the Oskol River, south of Kupiansk itself, will be fully under Russian control. And the Russians also control Sinkovka, and they will control other places around Kupiansk as well. If this was a reconnaissance in force, which is what I think, then it is a sign, an indicator that the Russians are now indeed thinking about an offensive against Kupiansk. This sort of thing has happened many times, by the way. The Russians probably did send a reconnaissance group into Mirnograd, the western suburb of Pokrovsk, back in August, and then pulled it out again. They did the same at Selidovo. There was a lot of reports and chatter that this was the beginning of a storming operation of first Mirnograd and then Selidovo. It turned out otherwise in both cases, but Selidovo is now under full Russian control. Mirnograd will be, and before long, so will Kupiansk, just to say. But anyway, this is the big story on the internet, the Russian and Ukrainian internet this morning. Some think that the Russians are now storming Kupiansk. Others say that the Russians have pulled out and that the Ukrainians still control Kupiansk. In my opinion, this isn't especially important one way or the other. The Battle of Kupiansk will soon begin, even if it hasn't fully started yet. That's what I wanted to say. Now, all of this distracts from the major events elsewhere. There's a continued collapse of Ukrainian positions south, in the southwest of Donbass, in Kurakhovo, and around Pokrovsk. The Russians have now resumed advances, by the way, south of Pokrovsk. They appear to be gradually taking more and more territories immediately to the south of Pokrovsk under control, though it looks as if the major attack is going to be, for the moment, is focused on Kurakhovo. The Russians appear to have captured the village of Ilinka on the north bank of the Kurakhovo reservoir. They are advancing to clear the remaining villages. The destruction of the dam has effectively trapped the Ukrainian troops in Kurakhovo, in that town, and the Russians continue their advance on Dalnye, village to the south of Kurakhovo. Indeed, there are reports that they might already have captured that village. The Ukrainians apparently tried to counterattack. The reports say the Ukrainian counterattack was unsuccessful, and there's all kinds of film showing Ukrainian troops, Ukrainian armored vehicles, trundling or trying to move along the roads towards this village, only to be destroyed on the road by the Russian drones, most of which, by the way, I suspect are Lancet drones rather than FPV drones, just to say. Anyway, so that's been going on in the battles around Kurakhovo. There are reports that the Russians now control the whole of eastern Kurakhovo up to a stream, a small river that passes through Kurakhovo. There are different discussions, debates about the significance of that. Again, I go with a report that appeared yesterday in Redovka, which is admittedly a Russian newspaper, but it appeared to conclude that the capture of eastern Kurakhovo was, from a Russian perspective, a success, and that the Russians are now in a good position to continue to advance in the central area of Kurakhovo, that this river or ravine or whatever it is doesn't form a particularly significant obstacle, especially with the Russians located north of Kurakovo on the north bank of the Kurakovo reservoir and able to shell any Ukrainian position in Kurakovo itself from their positions on the northern bank, and with the Russians outflanking Kurakovo from the south through their attack on the village of Danye. And of course, there's also reports that the Ukrainians are trying to pull their troops from the villages, the other villages, Yelizavetivka and the others, located to the south of Kurakovo, that the Ukrainians are trying to extract these Ukrainian troops before the pincers around them close and these troops find themselves trapped in a cauldron. So all very dramatic news going on in Kurakovo, but it is, if anything, now overshadowed by the events shaping up around Velika Novosilka, because it's now clear that the Russians are advancing towards Novosilka, Velika Novosilka, from multiple directions, from the east, from Zolota Niva and from Shakhtorsk, from the south, from Urozhaine and Makarivka, which they have now recaptured, but also from the west, having captured places like Rivnopol. The Russians are working towards what looks like a complete encirclement of the Ukrainian troops in Velika Novosilka, and it is widely expected that rather than allow that encirclement to happen, the Ukrainians are likely to withdraw from Velika Novosilka also fairly soon. So that opens the way. The fall of Velika Novosilka, in theory, ought to open the way for a Russian advance towards Zaporozhye region and the great city of Zaporozhye itself. The entire Ukrainian defense line in this area, east of the Dnieper, is collapsing. And of course, when Kurakovo falls, probably within the next couple of days, then the way will indeed be open for the Russians to advance towards the Dnieper from several directions, from the south, General Teplinsky's troops, and from the west, from the east. And of course, when Pokrovsk falls, the Russians can also advance towards the Dnieper, towards the city of Dnipro as well. Now, there's been some suggestions that with Zaporozhye city being a city of around 700,000, it would be all but impossible for the Russians to capture Zaporozhye. And the contrast that has been made is with Bakhmut, a town of only 70,000 people, and it was ferociously defended by the Ukrainians for, the better part of a year. And if it took the Russians that long to capture Bakhmut, how quickly would the Russians be able to capture a much bigger place, a place 10 times the size, like Zaporozhye? I don't think this comparison is valid. I think that when the Battle of Bakhmut took place a year and a half ago, the Ukrainian army was still very strong. It has now been very, very severely weakened. It's far lower in material. And of course, the quality of the men in the Ukrainian army has significantly declined, as confirmed by every report. I am not suggesting that the capture of Zaporozhye would be a straightforward operation, but the Russians did capture early in the war Mariupol, which has a population of around 500,000 before the war. So it's not that much smaller than Zaporozhye. Obviously, it would be a complicated and difficult operation. But for the record, I think that the Russian forces which are gathering around in southwest Donbass which are said to outnumber the Ukrainian troops in the area by a ratio of 6-1, I suspect that these Russian forces are likely to be equal to that task, if that is indeed the Russian plan. But I am not going to anticipate Russian moves. As I've said many times, the Russian General Staff does not share its plans with me. Suffice to say that even as the situation in Kiev collapses into plotting and intrigue, even as a tremendous bureaucratic war is brewing in Washington, even as the Europeans wring their hands and tell themselves what they're going to do, even as all of this is happening, the Russians continue their advance. Well, that's where I'm going to finish my program today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget, you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this program. And that's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.